We're now just a couple weeks after Easter. And in Easter, we ask the question, He is risen, now what? And we're sitting with that question now in the few weeks after, as we look through stories of the Scripture, reminding ourselves of who it is that God calls us to be and is yearning for us to be. And we're trying to find what it is that God's mission is in the world and what kind of people God calls and how He equips them and uses them. And so today we're going to look at the book of Ruth. And if you're familiar with Ruth, I hope you'll enjoy this story. If you're not, I would suggest trying to find time today or this week to read that book. It's only 4 chapters long. It is a delightful story with a lot of redemption and happiness, and kind of starts with the negative, and we'll read that just in a minute, and it just builds towards goodness throughout. It's a lot of fun and fairly short, so I would recommend checking it out and digging in. Again, only 4 chapters long. We're going to start the story today with the bad news, if that's all right, and then we'll work forward. And the bad news is given to us in the first 5 verses of the book. Right away, we are told a series of just terrible things that happens to the characters in this book. And so I'm going to invite you to join me in standing as we read Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Would you follow along and read along with me? Starting with verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrodites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Now, let's take a moment to recognize the deep, deep tragedy here. There's a series of 6 things that happen in this text, all of which are incredibly bad news, piled upon bad news, to make it worse and worse. The depth of the tragedy should not be missed so that we can understand the hope in the redemption. First of all, we find out that there is a famine in the land of Judah where our characters are from. Now, in this time, this is like an economic crash whenever a famine comes. It is outside of the control of the local people, and it deeply impacts the financial systems, the amount of food that there is. It is chaos when there is famine. And so anytime a famine comes through, everyone falls into chaos, and this family is not without chaos themselves. And so they are left to determine the question, what are we going to do now? And the choice that they make is the second terrible thing that happens. They decide that they are going to become displaced, migrant, leave the country looking for food in other places. And so they leave behind their land, their people, their family, their extended family, and they go to another place hoping for better fortune than they're finding at their home. But that leads to the third problem in the text, and that is the place where there is food and famine is not happening is in enemy territory. When they choose to go to Moab, this is not just a generic place down the road. Moab, we are told over and over and over in the Old Testament, is among the king enemies of the Jewish people. There is great animosity recorded up and down the Old Testament between the Moabites and the Jews. And so their chance for survival, they decide, is to cross into enemy territory and live among sworn enemies of their people. Which then leads to the fourth tragedy, and that is the sons of Naomi and Elimelech are now going to grow up and marry foreign women, which is an issue of hot debate throughout the Old Testament. It is prohibited in the Scriptures, and lots of times, lots of people go against this law, but these men have no choice. They come of age to get married, and there are no Jewish women in the neighborhood that they live in Moab now. And so they are going to marry foreign women, women from Moab. And there we go. Along comes the fifth tragedy, and that is this, that Elimelech dies, and then within 10 years, both sons of Naomi die. Which then leads to the sixth tragedy, and that is Naomi is alone, she is landless, she owns nothing, her sons are her retirement plan, and she may have to go back to her homeland, but in the homeland, it is possible that the land that they owned there, which was useless during the famine, may have been seized by local property owners and divided among themselves. It was of hot debate from community to community as to whether or not when a family abandoned their land, if it became communal property to be redistributed, or how long they had before they could come back and seize it once more. So there's a series of 6 incredible tragedies all around Naomi in this text. Her life has gone from blessed, she had 2 fine sons, a wonderful husband, land, to utter and absolute curse and chaos. She has nothing, not family, not land. She is displaced, living in foreign land, and she decides that she is going to do something about this. What she decides she's going to do is go back to the land of her forefathers, hope that maybe her land is there and that there may be someone related to her who would take her in. So she goes to her 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws and she says to them, "Ladies, you're still young and spry. I think you could probably find another husband willing to marry you. Why don't you try to jump back into the dating pool? No one is going to marry me. I'm old. I've got nothing to offer. I'm going to go home and see if someone will take me in." Now, her 2 daughter-in-laws hear this, and they both hear it in very different ways. Orpah, who, because of my certain age, I grew up being sure that this said Oprah, but it doesn't. The P and the R are switched. I heard at some point that Oprah's parents read this story and named her and then spelled it wrong. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard this before, that she's named after Orpah, but they spelled it wrong. But I always thought it was Oprah. But Orpah hears this and says, "Yeah, Naomi, that sounds right. Peace. You've been a good mother-in-law. See you later. Good luck journeying back." And the other daughter-in-law, Ruth, said, "Well, no, I can't possibly have you journey back alone. I love you. I've been taken into your house. Let's do this together." And Naomi says, "That's crazy, Ruth." And Ruth says, "No, I will go with you. I will go wherever you go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will follow you wherever you go." It sounds like a song that Chris Tomlin could write. So anyways, Ruth takes up with Naomi, and they go back to her homeland, and when they get there, people recognize her. And they remember her from back in their younger days, high school and college, and they're so excited, "Naomi, welcome back!" And Naomi responds with like the wildest line she possibly can. "Don't call me Naomi anymore. My name is no longer Naomi. Call me Mara." Now, we may not all know our Hebrew in here, but Naomi means sweet, and Mara means bitter. And so she's saying, my life has become so bitter that I should not even be associated with a name so sweet as Naomi. Now, to put this in modern times today, this would be like if someone from your high school class came into town and you said, "Jane, it's so good to see you." And she said, "No, call me Dumpster from now on." Why would I call you Dumpster? That's an awful name. Well, because I feel like trash and like God has left me behind a safe way to rot. Oh, this is essentially how Naomi is talking. She's in that kind of space of depression and brokenness. The series of bad things that have happened to her have piled on so deeply that she doesn't even recognize the woman who was called Naomi. She needs to be something else, something more bitter, something more miserable, because she feels as though life has turned on her and she no longer is living in anything that is sweet or good. But Ruth is sweet and good. Ruth has come with her, and Ruth wants to help her thrive. Ruth wants to set her up for success. And so she begins to understand the cultures that she doesn't know of Israel. She knows nothing about how they're set up in Israel. She does not know about their sources of justice. She doesn't know how they take care of widows. She knows nothing. And so Naomi begins to tell her these things. And Ruth goes about executing these things. So there was a law in Israel written right into Leviticus called gleaning. And gleaning, the basic idea was this: that you were a landowner, that you could produce your own crop, you were to leave the outside of all four sides of your crop unharvested, so that impoverished people, widows, and even migrant foreigners could come by and take whatever they needed to eat. You see, in this time, if you were poor, you couldn't just go down to the hardware store or to a restaurant to get a job. You grew your food. You owned your food. And if you did not have land, how would you possibly eat? And so baked into the system of economics and justice in Israel was this idea that foreigners, impoverished, widows, struggling people had an opportunity to take from people who were thriving in order to feed themselves. And so Naomi explained this to Ruth and sent her out to a field where Naomi's family might have owned. And Ruth began to work on the edges, and she would take barley and wheat, and she would bring it back to Naomi, and they would cook and eat on this law of gleaning inside of the nation of Israel. It went so far as to, when grapes would grow, if you had a vineyard, that you could only pluck what was ripe and take home what was ripe. And what was not ripe, you were supposed to leave on the branches so that people could come through when they became ripe and eat them if they were hungry or unable to feed themselves. It went so far that if you took a crop of grape or barley or wheat or whatever it was and picked it up and put it on your shoulder and started walking back, and grapes popped off and fell on the ground, or a piece of barley fell on the ground, you were to leave it there so that someone who didn't have could come behind you and eat. This was the system of caring for people who were have-nots in their society. And Naomi, once a landowner with sons to work the land, was now so desperate that she found herself in this situation where she needed the laws to work in her favor. And Ruth, who's a foreign woman, now Israel stood out. The other nations around them had laws similar to this, but nothing for foreigners. Foreigners were not allowed to participate in systems of gleaning like this. But Israel did look after the foreigner. Israel did write into its law that foreigners were allowed to glean and that they were part of who you should be leaving behind for. So when this Moabite woman is walking through Israel, she's in a unique situation in the world that they knew. Other neighboring countries, and she would be excluded. Her hand would be slapped and she'd be sent away. But in Israel, this Moabite woman was welcome. Even though she was the enemy, she was welcome to take from this land. And so Naomi starts asking questions about what field it is that she's harvesting from. And she tells Naomi about this lovely man named Boaz who owns it. And Naomi thinks, yes, we're related to him. And Naomi says, okay, that's great. Ruth says that's great. But Naomi says, no, you don't understand. This is another law of Israel. See, written in the Old Testament, I mean, you can find this in multiple places. Exodus 48, Exodus 6, Genesis 48, Leviticus 27, Leviticus 25. It's written all in the law that there's this thing called the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer. Ruth, he is our kinsman redeemer. If he is willing, he can take us into his household, absorb all of our bitterness and our poverty, and make us to be a part of a household again. Wow, what incredible turn of events that could possibly be. So Naomi starts concocting this plan that she invites Ruth into. Naomi is, related to him. It could be awkward, right? But Ruth is not, and she's young and beautiful and desirable. And so she starts telling Ruth, hey, well, when you're going to go over there, why don't you spray a little perfume on you? Wear something nice. I can't imagine being Ruth in this scenario, though, right? Like, how awkward would it be for your mother-in-law trying to get you dating again to someone else in your husband's family. A little weird if you ask me, but Ruth goes along with it. And so Naomi says, hey, next time you go over there, check out where it is that Boaz sleeps. Find where his bed is and be sure that it's his bed. And so Ruth does just that. She figures out which bed is Boaz's and comes back and says, what am I going to do now? She says, well, tonight you're going to go over there. You're going to smell your best with the best perfume you can find. You're going to put on your finest dress, whatever it was they wore. And I want you to go there and I want you to uncover his feet and lay at his feet. And then he'll tell you what to do. Now, I don't know if you've read this text specifically before. It's definitely vague, to say the least. There are people who study this stuff for a living who believe that that this was a sensual evening, and there are people who read this who say, no, literally nothing happened. She laid at his feet. Boaz was a perfect gentleman. She was a perfect lady. She went home. I'm not going to try to solve this debate today. You can read it for yourself. Sometimes I think Bible writers, when they want you to know something, they're not afraid to put pretty grotesque things in there. This is much more vague, and I think that I more fall on the side of saying that nothing happened here. And I think nothing happened because Boaz seems so concerned about making sure she gets out of this scenario without people thinking anything of her. And so I think that this is a pretty chaste, low-key event. But if you want to read a Danielle Steele novel into the 3rd chapter of Ruth, I think there's a way to do that. But either way, Naomi concocts this plan. Ruth goes in. She lays at his feet. Boaz wants to know what in the world is going on, as one would, I think, when someone is uncovering your feet. While you're sleeping. That seems like a pretty scary thing to be happening. They have this conversation. Ruth announces her intention, and Boaz says that he would love to be her kinsman redeemer, and that he is really flattered by the fact that she's so young and pretty, and there's so many young and handsome men around, and he's kind of advancing in age, and that's really nice of you to choose me. I mean, you didn't have to do that. He seems to think that his fortunes are waning as well, and he says, but there's one little piece of bad news, just one piece of bad news. Ruth, there's someone in front of you and Naomi to be your kinsman redeemer. And so in order to do what's right, we've got to offer him to be your kinsman redeemer first. And so the 4th chapter of Ruth is like this, it's a courtroom scene, really. They call in elders from the town. The other kinsman redeemer is there. Boaz brings it and calls it all to order, and he says, hey, listen, Naomi is back, and she needs a kinsman redeemer, and she's got a plot of land that's still hers. I think she's going to sell it. And hey, buddy, it's yours if you want it. And the guy, like, you can see, like, if this is a cartoon, there'd be, like, dollar bills in his eyes. Whoa, I've won the lottery. Great, yeah, let's redeem her, and I will take that land. And Boaz says, hey, there's one other thing. She comes with a Moabite woman, she's young, and you'd probably have to marry her into your family, too. And the guy says, oh, a Moabite woman. I'm good. Thanks for asking. And at that point, Boaz is the next one. This is how kinsman redeemer works. There's a succession of who has the most right to execute this option. And Boaz is number 2, at which point he says to the elders, I would like to take them into my house as their kinsman redeemer. I'd like to marry Ruth into my family, become her husband. And everyone celebrates and welcomes Ruth and Naomi. And they are redeemed from this incredibly terrible story that begins with a succession of things getting worse by worse by worse 6 times over. Boaz redeems them. And the elders of the town say something really fascinating to Boaz as he redeems them. They say to him, we are witnesses of this. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. Rachel and Leah, of course, are matriarchs of the whole nation of Israel. And they're saying, may this woman, Moabite, this nobody in our community, this woman from our enemy country, may she bless Israel in the same way as Rachel and Leah. Now that's a massive blessing. That's an unbelievable blessing. And what is amazing is that the two of them, Boaz and Ruth, they marry one another and conceive and have a child. And the child they name Obed. I don't know if any of you are looking for child names. Sometimes people like to name their children after biblical characters. Obed is a choice that's here in the Bible. Obed ends up having a child whose name is Jesse. And Jesse is the father of David, who becomes the king of Israel and becomes the shape of the Messiah that Israel yearns for as they wait for Jesus. Ruth becomes the blessing to Israel that was hoped for when she was redeemed by Boaz. This story it's a feel-good story. It's a happy story of good characters. Each person in this story really is good, and the only way you could ever look down upon them is through the eyes of someone who is better. Each person does good and helps one another, and it's the story really of Israel's system working and working well. And in each scenario, there's grace and hope and restoration and redemption for the characters who are doing it right in this story. But I wonder in this story as well if you relate to any of these people. Let me break it down to you like this, if I could. There are really three major characters, although there are many others. And if we wanted to, I suspect we could find ourselves in the stories of all three, but maybe one more than the other. Perhaps you would see yourself as understanding Naomi the best. Especially in a season of difficulty, there's been so many hard things happening in our world, in our life, disconnect and lost jobs and illness, and oh my goodness, what a year it's been, right? And you could just feel like it's been one thing after another. Just as soon as something bad happens and you think, oh, it couldn't get possibly worse than this, something worse happens. And then when you think this must be rock bottom, something worse happens still. Maybe those shoes fit just like Naomi's on your feet. Maybe you stand in her place and understand how she feels. It has been one terrible thing after another, and the only way I can get out of this is by choosing a bad choice that is less bad than another. Naomi seems like she has hit rock bottom in the beginning of the story. What could possibly be worse than her family fortune dying, finding herself displaced in a foreign land, her retirement and her sons are dead, and all she has left is a foreign daughter-in-law? Maybe those shoes fit you really well. Maybe Ruth's shoes fit you a little better. I have a feeling that this is the most rare of the major characters, but she is the best of all the good characters in this story. And there are always those around us who look like Ruth, and thank God for people like them. They're optimists. They're willing to go. They're willing to listen to God's call in their life, and they're willing to do risky things and to go into risky places. They always seem willing to try the next thing, and they think of others around them more than themselves. Ruth is unbelievable in what she lets Naomi talk her into, but she always does it with an eye on making sure that Naomi is taken care of. And she does so with joy and character and hope and gladness throughout. Every time you think Ruth couldn't do something better, she finds a better thing to do still. And she wins people over around her. And she becomes the hope of Israel, at least indirectly, in that she starts the lineage of the best king Israel ever had. And also begins the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. Now, Ruth's story is so important, in fact, that it gets told on throughout the years. Now, after the exile, when they come back, Ezra and Nehemiah are trying to reestablish the law. And one of the things that's really being pushed is we've got to get back to stop marrying foreign people and marry Jews and create a Jewish community. And this story was cited by the dissenters saying, okay, we get marry Jews and be Israel, but what do you do with Ruth? And so her story becomes this really difficult story to contend with for Israel. who are we going to be? What is God calling us to be when we read on the one hand not to marry foreign women, and on the other hand, Ruth is such a crucial part of our story, and she was an enemy Moabite person. This is a hard thing for the Jewish people to reconcile and wrestle with, especially after the exile, and they were trying to determine again who they were going to be going forward. But that's how good Ruth is that she's an exception to the rule in such a profound way that she sticks with them for generations. That's the kind of impact that Ruth made on people around her. No, those shoes might fit you. You might want to be that kind of impactful person, that positive, generational, go wherever God is calling and do whatever God wants to do, missionary mindset, unafraid of any scenario, always proclaiming the goodness of God. That may be you, but I have a feeling that's the smallest minority of all of us. But thank God for the people who feel a sense of Ruth in their life. I imagine the most of us would fit most comfortably into Boaz's shoes. Now, Boaz is not supposed to be a major character here. Ruth is the major character. She's amazing, right? But I have a feeling that most of us could slip on Boaz's shoes most comfortably and understand his situation. Boaz wasn't especially special. He was a man who God was important to, and so he followed the law. He did things that seemed simple, but were precisely what a good Jewish man who follows God and loves the Lord does. He made sure that the edges of his crops were left for people like Ruth, wandering foreigners who might even be the enemy. And I imagine that there were days that he would look out in his fields and see people who were taking from his crops, and he probably thought, they don't deserve to take from me. He probably thought it was hard some days to leave money and food on the table for other people to take, but this is what God called him and asked him to do. There were probably days that it was very, very difficult for him to follow the law, to be a good Jewish man. And he had to make a series of choices to say yes to the call that God had on his life. But Boaz never went anywhere. He was from Bethlehem. He owned land there. He had a job there. And his life was to, day after day, live the life where he was planted, doing one right thing after another that God had called him to do. And through this time, he wasn't building an empire. He wasn't saving the world. He wasn't going to foreign nations. He doesn't seem to be trying to save everyone around him. He is just simply saying yes to God with little things, building character one day at a time, one step in front of the other, doing the right thing, being who God asked him to be at his home, at his work. And he probably never could have imagined that he would have become a major character in God's plan to bring about a righteous king to Israel, who would then start a line to bring about the Messiah years after he was dead. But he was open to the moment when God needed him to do something big. And again, being a kinsman redeemer is baked into the law. He's just being a good Jew. But when the moment was placed before him, he was ready to do the big part of his story because of his choices and actions to do the little things along the way, doing the right thing that God asked him to do step by step by step through his life, in the home where he was planted, in the town where he was from. It all seems deeply unspectacular until his moment came. He simply said yes to God with all of the little things, so he was prepared to say yes to the big thing. I imagine that's the shoe that fits most of us. We try to bloom where we're planted. This is where God has led us and set us. This is the simple life we have, and sometimes it doesn't seem like God is asking us to do anything all that risky, but still, there are little things. Say hi to that lonely person. Give $20 to that homeless man. Little by little things that God asks us to do, waiting so that we're ready in the place where we live, the place where we're planted, the place that we are now. When God is ready to use us, we practiced doing the right things so often, saying yes to God so often in little things, that when God's mission comes to us, we're ready to participate in the big thing that God has us to do with our lives and in our lives. We can be like Boaz. But I also know that mission and ministry is hard, even if you don't have to displace, even if you don't have to go. So often it's easy to look upon people who are struggling and think, oh, that is going to take a lot of work. That is going to be really hard. God, if I say yes to this thing you're asking me, that's going to take a lot of money, time, energy, exhaustion, etc., etc., etc. Ministry can be hard, no doubt about it. Following God's call can be hard. In fact, I've got a short little video that I want to show you that really shows how ministry can be, and I suspect you can identify with it both as a minister and the sheep. And so let's watch this video together real fast. This is a lamb or a sheep that's caught in a ditch. And that poor minister to the lamb is probably feeling like, I do not have time to do this again. Being like Boaz is not easy, even though it's not going. But being like Boaz means that we are ready for what God wants to use us for, where we are. God is working to redeem the world. This idea of kinsman redeemer is so helpful because, well, we may not be kin to everyone we talk to. We can identify with and own the role of redeemer in the name of God, the God we serve who is redeeming everyone around us. And so when he calls us to a people that he is yearning to redeem. And we may find, just like Boaz, that we've been practicing for this our whole life. And so who knows where you'll be, but God may call you where you live, where you work, where you serve, where you go to school, where you play ball, where you golf, where you eat out, where you go to the gym. God may call you in the places you're already planted to use the little yeses you've said with your life to turn this one into a big yes. That God is working to redeem people around you, and they may be sheep caught in a ditch that are going to jump right back into the ditch. But that's God's call for mission in our life. And so the band is going to come out and we're going to do this last song. And I just want to read some words for you. I want it to really resonate with how we've talked about this work that God is doing through Boaz and how we're invited to be a part of his mission, whether we're planted where we're at or we're sent to go. But this is the heart of God captured in this song that we'll sing in just a moment. So sit in it and listen to it and then prepare to sing it with the band as well. It goes like this. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. If you left the grave behind, so will I. Man, we get to join in partnership with God. I can see your heart in everything you've done, every part designed in a work of art called love. If you gladly chose surrender, so will I. I can see your heart a billion different ways. Every precious one, a child you died to save. And if you gave your life to love them, so will I. This is the call to mission. It's a call found in Ruth. It's called found throughout Scripture. God is working to redeem the world. And we get to be the part of kinsman redeemer, joining him in his mission. He's calling us. We don't always have to go. Sometimes we have to stay. But still, we get to join in his mission to redeem the world and to make it right. Would you join me in standing?